Monarch was formed with the single goal of researching and tracking giant monsters, an organization the government never thought it would have to create. Since Godzilla's first sighting in World War II, after he was awakened by an American nuclear submarine, he made his way to various cities across the globe. And since then, there has been an unprecedented amount of casualties. It was something we could have never expected and never have prepared for. But the way to get a better understanding of these creatures and prepare for the future is to learn from mistakes made in the past. And one way we're going to save lives is by looking at how civilians unfortunately lost their lives to these monsters in the first place, so that we may prepare ourselves come the event where Godzilla may rise out of the ocean once again. In 1943, something sunk the USS Lawton, a battleship used towards the end of the war. The only surviving crew member, William Randa, claimed it was a creature more terrifying than anything we could have imagined. Officials thought he was crazy, but it was later confirmed that the creature was indeed Godzilla. 2,700 crew members tragically lost their lives in the wreck. Relatives to those in the ship were told it was destroyed by a Japanese vessel. In the 40s and early 50s, Godzilla, at war with another creature known as the Shinomura, flattened countless small villages off on remote islands, as well as locations surrounding Western Australia, New Zealand, Guam and Yap. We estimate approximately 3,000 civilians lost their lives in the fight, though this number is expected to be even higher due to the sheer amount of undocumented villages that were unfortunately never found. Monarch has done an extraordinary job keeping these titans out of the public eye. For 60 years, creatures like Godzilla were kept under wrap, a task which many would consider to be impossible. With nuclear weapons, we were able to keep these creatures to remote areas, islands, all while attempting to kill it. But now the cat's out the bag and we must protect civilians by any means necessary. So how do we lose the lives of so many? And have we gotten better at saving them? Well, as you know, the public first caught sight of Godzilla in 2014 in Honolulu, Hawaii. We learned that early indications of Godzilla's arrival are a receding tide. This is because the amount of displaced water caused by the sheer mass of Godzilla causes a tsunami, and Godzilla, unlike a storm, couldn't be predicted, back in 2014 at least, and his arrival was unfortunately unprepared for. The Navy attempted to give the local law enforcement some notice, but by that point, he already began making his way to land. The government had always been anxious to see how Godzilla would be sighted by the public, if he even wanted to be seen. And if he was going to be seen, how many people would have to die for the truth to be out there? We got our answer. 356 lives lost from the flooding alone. Most people drowned during the initial wave, dragged underwater by the sheer force of the tsunami. Others suffocated inside collapsed buildings. Some even lost their lives in the crowd's violent stampedes. Due to the unusual nature of the tsunami, the flood was able to quickly recede, and thankfully made the process of rescuing those stranded easier. Though emergency services were still stretched thin, and with the roads blocked off from the debris left by the flooding, many ambulances couldn't get to where they needed to go, and dozens of people couldn't be rescued in time. Thankfully, since the attack took place in fall, casualties were lower than they could have been, thanks to tourism not being as popular in that time of year. But this was still a tragic event that we have since learned from. On land, Godzilla tried to stay out of the way of buildings whenever possible, with only 14 people dying when his tail scraped against an office building, which was thankfully closed for the evening. Godzilla would proceed to challenge another giant creature present at the time, now referred to as Hokuto, an ancient parasite which would bury itself into corpses of recently deceased members of Godzilla's species. Their fight began at Honolulu International Airport, where 224 lives would be lost from collapsed infrastructure, with 168 left with life-changing injuries. A helicopter collided with Godzilla's dorsal plates during a defensive operation, killing both pilots and a weapons operator. The crash led to a chain of events that would lead to a massive explosion, caused by the ignition of the aircraft fuel in the docked Boeing 737. This led to a further 14 people losing their lives in the fire, with 16 left with third-degree burns. As the fight began to move towards the ocean, where the Hokuto was retreating towards, the ones that were struggling to survive the initial flood would be met with intermittent earthquakes, while the two giants violently lunged at each other, which made the less stable buildings collapse, leading to 823 civilians losing their lives in the destruction. The government has moved to recognize this tragic event as a moment to be remembered, so we can take a moment to think of the 1,436 men, women and children that tragically lost their lives in Hawaii that night. The public got their next glimpse at Godzilla in San Francisco, where the Navy encountered him rising out of the Pacific Ocean next to the Golden Gate Bridge. There were still hundreds of civilian vehicles on that bridge, as well as dozens of military personnel there for support. Godzilla seemed at first docile, but in retaliation to the military's defense, burst straight through the center of the bridge, killing 178 civilians and 52 soldiers. We had no time to mourn the loss of lives, as within the hour, Godzilla would meet with the Hokuto with plans of fighting him in one of the biggest cities in the world. Law enforcement had to perform one of the biggest evacuations of recent years, but due to the unexpected and unusual nature of the attack, some weren't aware of the potential dangers and didn't make it to shelter. Some shelters were even damaged in the attack, which was far more dangerous than even the strongest of hurricanes they were designed for. 1,175 civilians perished in the onslaught, caught between three warring gods. Many were still in their homes at the time, thinking they'd be safe, ignorant of the amount of danger coming their way. The government set out to be sure this wouldn't happen again. Thanks to their funding, we've been able to advance our technological prowess to track Godzilla from Monarch's very own state-of-the-art research facility, Castle Bravo, to learn his territorial routes, and based on his trajectory, we're able to accurately predict where Godzilla's going to end up hours before he even gets there, meaning we give potential hotspots enough time to prep and evacuate the surrounding areas. Recent examples include the terrific way the Boston Emergency Services handled the situation prior to Monster Zero's and Godzilla's arrival, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. Approximately 234 civilians lost their lives in the disaster, which is a significant decline in fatalities, meaning we are improving, but that's still 234 more lives than we would have liked. This means in total we've tragically lost between 8,000 to 10,000 innocent lives to Godzilla alone, and that's not counting the attacks from the 17 other titans we've confirmed the existence of. And those are only the confirmed losses. Throughout the last 80 years, countless ships have been sunk across the world with little to no explanation as to how. Villages have been flooded with no signs of adverse weather, oil rigs have collapsed with foundations seemingly eaten away. This means the number could be as high as 20,000, potentially even more. This is why you're watching this at Monarch, to learn about these creatures. We need to take back control of our own planet from these monsters. We will not allow them to lead to the end of our civilization. Good luck.